The last thing my wife ever said about the farmhouse was that she wanted to die there. Not in a morbid way. She said it the way she said everything, matter-of-factly, standing at the kitchen window with a mug of tea going cold in her hand, watching the snow come down over the back field. "I want to die in this house, Hector," she said. "Promise me." I promised her. 3 weeks later, she was gone. That was 6 years ago, and I've kept that promise in every way I know how. The farmhouse has been in my family since 1958. My father built most of it himself. The back addition, the wraparound porch, the root cellar that still smells like the apples he stored there every October. It sits on 12 acres outside of Orangeville, Ontario, about an hour and 15 minutes northwest of Toronto depending on traffic and the season. The land is flat and quiet, and in the summer the fields go gold, and you can hear the wind moving through them from every room in the house. My wife, Carol, loved it from the first time I brought her there. We were 23 years old, and I was so nervous I'd convinced myself she wouldn't understand it, that she'd see the drafty windows and the cracked plaster in the upstairs hall and think I was bringing her somewhere that needed to be apologized for. Instead, she walked through every room slowly, touching the door frames, looking at the photographs my mother had arranged on the sideboard in the front room. And when we got to the kitchen, she stood at that window and said, "This is a real home." I married her 8 months later. We raised our son in that house. His name is Bryce. He grew up swimming in the creek at the back of the property, building fires in the pit my father had made from field stone, driving the riding mower in circles before he was old enough to do it straight. I thought he understood what the place meant. I believed that for a long time. He was 31 when he married Renee. They'd been together about 3 years, and I liked her well enough at first. She was sharp, had opinions about everything, laughed easily. The kind of woman who fills up a room. I thought that was a good quality, until I started to understand that what she was really filling the room with was herself, and that everyone else in it was expected to make space. The trouble started small, the way it usually does. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there. Renee had ideas about how the farmhouse should be run. Who visited? How often? What changed? She didn't like the way I kept Carol's china in the hutch in the dining room. Said it made the house feel stuck. I told her the house was 65 years old and had earned the right to feel however it wanted. She didn't laugh. When Bryce was made redundant from his job in Guelph, a restructuring, he said, nothing he could have seen coming, I offered them the farmhouse. It made sense at the time. I'd been spending more time at my sister's place in Kingston anyway, and the farmhouse needed someone living in it properly, keeping it up. The agreement was simple. They'd handle utilities and the upkeep, I'd cover the property taxes, and we'd revisit the arrangement in a year or two once Bryce was back on his feet. I didn't put it in writing. That's the part I go back to. They moved in on a Saturday in March. I helped carry boxes. Renee walked through the rooms with the focused expression of someone doing inventory. The first year was manageable. Bryce was job hunting and then working contract work, and they seemed genuinely grateful, or at least Bryce did. He called on Sundays. Renee was polite when I visited, which was every 6 weeks or so, staying in the back bedroom that had been mine growing up. It was still my house. I had to keep reminding myself of that. The second year, things shifted. Small things first. My father's workbench in the garage, cleared out, tools sold at a yard sale while I was in Kingston. Renee told me afterward that they'd needed the space. Carol's perennial garden along the south side of the house, dug up and replaced with what Renee called low-maintenance landscaping, which turned out to mean a strip of decorative gravel and 3 boxwood shrubs that always looked like they were apologizing for existing. I stood looking at it the first time I saw it and didn't say anything. I should have said something. The visit started to feel like I was a guest who hadn't quite been invited. My old bedroom was now an office for Renee's candle business, so I slept on a fold-out in the laundry room when I came to stay. No one suggested this was unreasonable. I accepted it because I was trying to be easy. I've spent a lot of my life trying to be easy. By the third year, I'd noticed they weren't paying the utilities reliably. I was getting calls from the hydro company, forwarded notices, a letter about the propane tank contract that hadn't been renewed. I raised it with Bryce. He said they'd hit a rough patch, that Renee's business was getting off the ground and things would stabilize. I advanced them $3,000. I told myself it was a loan. Then there was the matter of the photographs. I kept a box in the upstairs closet, the cedar-lined one off the landing, the one Carol had used for her good sweaters. In the box were things I cared about, letters my wife had written me before we were married, the small oil painting her mother had done of our backyard, and the photograph, the one from our wedding day, framed in the oval silver frame that had belonged to Carol's grandmother. In it we're standing on the steps of the United Church in town, Carol laughing at something I just said, her veil lifted by the wind. It's the best photograph I've ever been in. I used to look at it every time I visited and feel like something in me settled back into place. The box was where I'd left it. The photograph was not. I found the frame on the shelf in the master bedroom, our old bedroom, now Renee and Bryce's, empty. The backing had been removed. I stood there holding the empty frame for a moment before I understood what I was looking at. I found Renee in the kitchen. I asked her, keeping my voice even, where the photograph was. She didn't look up from her laptop. "I needed the frame," she said. "It goes with the aesthetic in there. The photo's in the recycling." I walked to the recycling bin in the garage. It had been emptied 2 days before. I stood in that garage for a long time. My wife's wedding photograph, in the recycling. I did not yell. I did not say what I wanted to say. I walked back into the house and told Bryce I needed to speak with him privately, and the three of us ended up in the kitchen with Renee looking put upon and Bryce looking at the floor, and I said, quietly, that what had been done was unacceptable, and that I expected to be consulted before anything in that house was touched, discarded, or changed. Renee said, "Hector, we live here. This is our house now. You need to respect that." I looked at my son. He looked at the floor. I drove back to Kingston that evening. I didn't say goodbye properly. I sat in the car on my sister's street for 20 minutes before I went inside. Her name is Lois, and she's 70, and she's the sharpest person I know. And when I came through the door and told her what had happened, she looked at me steadily and said, "What are you going to do about it?" I said I didn't know yet. She said, "You know." I spent that night going through papers. I have a filing system that Carol set up years ago. Color-coded folders, everything in chronological order, very her. And I found the original deed to the property, the transfer documents from when my father left it to me in his will, the survey maps, all of it. The house was mine, free and clear. There was no lease agreement, no formal tenancy arrangement, no written contract of any kind. I had let my son and his wife live in my home on the basis of a handshake and goodwill, and I had not protected any of it. I called my lawyer the next morning. His name is Doug, and his office is in Orangeville, not in Vancouver, not across the country, right there in the same county as the property. He's been handling my affairs for 15 years. I told him what the situation was. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to sell the house. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you sure? Once it's done?" "I know," I said. "And the tenancy situation." "I know, Doug. What do we need to do first?" What we needed to do first, he explained, was establish the situation clearly. Because they had been living there without a formal lease, they were considered month-to-month tenants under Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act, which meant they had rights. I couldn't simply change the locks. I had to serve proper notice. N12 form, landlord's own use or sale of property, and give them 60 days minimum. Doug walked me through everything. I took notes. I'd spent 40 years working in logistics, and I still took notes. I did not tell Bryce any of this while I was preparing. I spent 3 weeks getting everything in order before I served notice. In that time, I did several things quietly. I contacted a real estate agent in Orangeville, a woman named Bev, who had sold 2 properties on the same concession road in the past few years and knew the market. She came out for a walkthrough, while Bryce and Renee were at Bryce's in-laws for a long weekend. She walked through every room and didn't comment on the decorative gravel or the missing perennial beds. She was professional. She told me what the property was worth. The number was more than I expected. Rural Ontario had changed since the pandemic years. People moving out of the city, prices following them. I had a locksmith make me a new set of keys. I had the propane tank contract moved back into my name. I transferred the utility accounts back to myself and set up pre-authorized payments. I went through the house room by room when I had access, and I took everything that was mine. Not everything I might have had a sentimental claim to. What was mine, specifically my father's survey maps, Carol's remaining china that hadn't been sold or broken, the box of letters, the silver frame that now held nothing, a small watercolor of the Niagara Escarpment that Carol had bought at a craft fair in Creemore the summer before she was diagnosed. I packed these things carefully and drove them to a storage unit in Guelph. I thought about the photograph the whole drive there. I served the N12 notice on a Tuesday morning. I drove out myself. Doug had offered to have it couriered, but I wanted to do it in person. Not to be unkind. I wasn't interested in a confrontation. I just needed to see it done. Bryce answered the door. He looked at the envelope, then at me. "Dad," he said. "You'll have 60 days, I said. "Doug's information is in there if you have questions about the process. I hope you use the time well." I handed him the envelope. He took it. His hand was shaking slightly, and I felt something move in my chest, and I did not let it change anything. I turned and walked back to my truck. Renee appeared in the doorway behind him. I heard her say something, her voice sharp, rising. But I was already at the truck and I didn't turn around. The next 60 days were not comfortable. Bryce called several times and I answered every call. I was not cold with him. I told him I loved him and that I was not doing this out of anger and that the decision was final. He asked if there was any way to revisit the arrangement. I told him there wasn't. He said they had nothing saved, that they'd assumed the house would eventually be theirs, that they'd been planning around it. I thought about the $3,000 I'd lent him that had never come up again. I thought about the workbench my father built with his own hands. Gone. I thought about the recycling bin. I told Bryce that 4 years of no rent in one of the most expensive housing markets in Canadian history was itself a form of inheritance, and that what he did with that advantage had been his own choice. He didn't have much to say to that. They were out by day 58. I don't know where they went immediately. To Renee's parents, I suspect, in Barrie. Bryce texted me when they left. He said, "We're out. Hope you're happy." I sat with that message for a while. I wasn't happy exactly. But I wasn't what I'd been before either. Bev had the listing up within a week of them leaving. The photographs were taken on a clear October morning, the maples along the drive at full color, the porch looking the way it used to when Carol kept her planters out. It listed on a Thursday. We had 4 offers by Sunday. We accepted one on Monday. It closed just before Christmas. I won't say what it sold for, except that it was enough to set me up comfortably for whatever's left, enough to make a donation to the hospice that cared for Carol in her last weeks, a donation large enough that they put a small plaque in the family room that bears her name. I went to see it in January. I stood in that room, and I looked at the plaque, and it was not the same as the oval frame on the sideboard, but it was something. It was her name, permanent, in a place where people go when they need to feel less alone. I think she would have liked that. I've been staying with Lois in Kingston and looking at a few properties. Nothing large, nothing that needs much. Maybe a 2-bedroom in a smaller town. Somewhere I can have a proper kitchen and a room for my books and a place to sit outside in the evenings. I'm not in a rush. For the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm managing anything. The farmhouse is someone else's to care for now. I hope they treat it well. Bryce called me in February. It was a different kind of call than the ones before. Quieter, less defensive. He said he'd been thinking. He said he understood, or was starting to. He asked if we could meet for coffee when I was next in Guelph. I said yes. We haven't met yet, but we will. That's what I hold on to. He's my son, and whatever Renee made him into during those years, he's still in there somewhere. I know, because I heard it in his voice on that call. The boy who used to drive the riding mower in circles before he could do it straight. Carol would have handled all of this better than I did. She would have said something months earlier, clearly and without apology, and the whole thing would have resolved differently. She was always better at speaking up when it mattered. But she's not here, and I had to do it my way, in my own time. And when I finally did, when I finally stopped trying to be easy and decided instead to be honest, I understood what she'd been showing me all those years. You protect what matters, quietly if you can, firmly if you must, and you don't wait until it's in the recycling. I've thought a lot about what Carol would say if she could see how all of this unfolded. She'd probably tell me I waited too long. She'd be right. What I've come to understand is that the way things ended wasn't really about the farmhouse. It wasn't even about the photograph, though that was the moment everything became undeniable. It was about a pattern that had been building for years. Small surrenders, each one reasonable on its own, that added up to something I barely recognized when I finally stopped to look at it clearly. I had confused being generous with being a pushover. I had confused keeping the peace with actually having peace. Those are not the same thing, and the difference cost me years of discomfort I didn't have to carry. When Renee said, "This is our house now," she wasn't just being rude. She was telling me something true about how the situation had been allowed to develop. Not because she was right, but because I had never once made it clear that she was wrong. Every time I'd stayed quiet about the workbench, the garden, the sleeping on the fold-out, I was, in a small way, agreeing. Silence looks like consent to people who want it to. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with, honestly. My son didn't become someone who looked at the floor while his wife threw out his mother's wedding photograph overnight. That happened slowly, and some of what allowed it to happen was my own reluctance to say hard things at hard moments. Kindness without clarity isn't really kindness. It's avoidance wearing a kind face. What finally changed things wasn't anger. It was a decision, clear, deliberate, made with a full understanding of what it would cost. I called Doug. I read the relevant sections of the Residential Tenancies Act. I made a spreadsheet. I moved methodically through each step because I understood that if I was going to do this, I had to do it properly, not out of emotion but out of principle. That's what I mean when I say that understanding the situation clearly, really looking at it without flinching, was what made it possible to act. You can't fix what you're not willing to see. And then there was the matter of following through, not just deciding, but doing. Serving that notice myself, driving out to the farmhouse, handing Bryce the envelope and walking back to the truck, while Renee's voice rose behind me. I didn't turn around. That took more out of me than I expected. It would have been so easy to turn around. I've learned that doing the right thing often feels worse in the moment than doing the convenient thing. The relief comes later, and it's quieter than you imagine. But it's real. I'm not a hard man. I don't want to be. Bryce called in February and I answered, and I'll meet him for coffee when the time is right, because he's my son, and that doesn't go away. But I'm also not the man who sleeps on a fold-out in his own home anymore. That man was trying so hard to be easy that he'd forgotten he was allowed to matter. Carol knew. She always did. You protect what matters, with honesty, with patience, and when the moment finally comes, with the courage to follow it all the way through.